The closing of the door was the sound of a world ending. It was a solid, final thud of oak against its frame, the iron latch falling into place with a click that echoed the snap of a bone. On the other side of that door was everything Ilara had known, the warmth of the hearth she and Silas had built, the smell of cedar from the marriage chest, the worn hollow in the floorboards where his chair had always rested. On this side, there was only the biting November wind and the hard-packed dirt of Promise Creek's main street. Mayor Graves stood on the porch, a man built of straight lines and hard angles, his face set like cold tallow. He pressed a small, worn leather pouch into her hand. The coins inside made a pathetic little clink. $20, he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. For the furniture and the stores, Silas's debts were considerable. The town must be made whole. He didn't need to say the rest. She was a widow of 3 months, and at 24, she was now a pauper. The farm, the house, the life Silas had promised her, it had all been built on a foundation of secret debt, a fact revealed only after the fever took him. Graves, the town's founder and sole banker, held the notes. He had been patient, he claimed. He had been generous. Now he was simply being practical. Her entire world had been liquidated. All that remained was a single piece of paper he'd given her earlier, the deed to a worthless parcel of land Silas had won in a foolish card game years ago. It was a place in the high country known only as the Frost Fisher, a name that was always spoken with a laugh. It was a scar on the north face of a granite bluff, a place where the sun never reached and the winter winds were said to be born. It was useless for grazing, impossible for farming. It was a joke, and it was all she had left. That, the clothes on her back, the sturdy axe Silas had always kept sharp as a razor, and Boro, his loyal wolf-gray dog, who now pressed against her leg, a low growl rumbling in his chest, directed at the closed door. The people of Promise Creek watched from their windows or from the boardwalk in front of Gable's Mercantile. They offered no help, only the suffocating blanket of their pity. Mr. Gable himself stepped out, wiping his hands on his apron. "Ilara, girl," he said, his tone condescendingly gentle, "you can't go up there. It's a tomb. Take a few of those dollars and buy a coach ticket east. A young woman like you can find work as a seamstress, a maid." A woman nearby nodded. "He's right. There's no shame in it. The Fisher is no place for a person. It's a place for ghosts." Ilara looked at their faces, saw their certainty of her failure. They had already written her story's end. She would freeze or starve or come crawling back to beg for scraps from the church charity box. In their eyes, she was already gone. A quiet, cold fury solidified in her gut, displacing the grief that had hollowed her out for weeks. It was a hard, clean feeling. She would not be a ghost. She would not be a beggar. She turned her back on them, her shoulders straight, and walked into Gable's Mercantile. The whispers followed her inside. She ignored them. With deliberate care, she laid her $20 on the counter. "I need 20 pounds of flour," she began, her voice steady, though she hadn't used it for much more than a whisper in months. 10 pounds of beans, a side of salt pork, a block of salt, a good skinning knife, and a whetstone. She paused, calculating, and that heavy wool blanket in the window. Mr. Gable stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. This was not the inventory of a woman fleeing east. It was the inventory of someone digging in for a siege. He packed her order in silence, his movements slow and reluctant, as if he were packing a coffin. When she shouldered the heavy sack and tied the blanket roll to its top, he cleared his throat. "The first snow is coming, Ilara. You won't last a week." "Then I will have a busy week," she said, her voice flat. She whistled once for Boro, who had been waiting at the door, a silent, watchful shadow. Together they stepped out onto the boardwalk, turned not east but north, and began the long walk toward the worthless land that was now her entire world. She did not look back. The journey was a punishment. The sack of supplies weighed like a stone, its straps digging into the bones of her shoulders. The trail out of Promise Creek quickly dissolved from a wagon-rutted road into a faint deer track climbing steadily into the rocky uplands. The friendly pines and aspens of the valley gave way to stunted, wind-twisted firs that clawed at the thin soil between slabs of granite. The air grew thinner, colder, and carried the sharp, clean scent of snow on its breath. Boro scouted ahead, his gray form a phantom against the gray rock, then circled back to walk beside her, his presence a silent comfort. For 2 days they walked. They slept huddled together for warmth under a rocky overhang, the wool blanket, a fragile shield against a cold that seemed to seep from the very bones of the earth. Ilara ate little, saving their meager rations. The physical exertion was a brutal anesthetic, numbing the pain of her loss, replacing it with the simple, screaming ache of her muscles. Late on the 2nd day, they arrived. The frost fissure was worse than the stories. It was a violent gash in a towering cliff face of dark granite, a vertical wound 100 feet long and 20 feet wide at its mouth. The ground before it was a treacherous slope of fallen rock and scree, choked with the skeletal remains of trees that had lost their purchase and tumbled down. The place felt dead. The air was still and heavy, and the silence was so profound it felt like a pressure against her ears. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered, nothing lived here. Ilara slid the sack from her shoulders, her body trembling with exhaustion. She stood before the fisher's maw and stared into the deep, absolute darkness within. This was her inheritance, a hole in a rock, a grave waiting to be filled. Mr. Gable's words echoed in her mind. It's a tomb. The town was right. They were all right. For the first time since the door of her home had closed, a wave of pure, bottomless despair washed over her. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto a cold, sharp-edged rock, the strength draining out of her like water from a sieve. She had been a fool. Her defiance had been nothing but a child's tantrum against the inevitable. Here, in this dead place, she would die. Boro, sensing her despair, whined and nudged her hand with his cold nose. When she didn't respond, he moved to the mouth of the fissure, sniffing intently at the base of the rock wall near the entrance. He pawed at a small pile of loose shale, then looked back at her and gave a low, questioning bark. Annoyed at his persistence, Ilara pushed herself to her feet. "There is nothing there, Boro," she said, her voice cracking. But the dog was insistent, whining again and digging at the rock. She walked over, ready to pull him away, when she felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible current of air flowing from the crack he was clearing. She knelt, expecting a blast of frigid cave air. But it wasn't cold. It was different. It was cool, yes, but it lacked the biting, damp chill of the outside. It was a dry, neutral air, steady and constant. Her curiosity piqued. She began to push aside the bigger pieces of shale with her raw hands. The flow of air grew stronger. She pressed her cheek against the opening she'd made and felt it, a slow, gentle exhalation from the deep earth. It was geothermal warmth, faint, subtle, but undeniably present. It was the planet's own deep heat, bleeding out through this flaw in the rock. The fissure wasn't a tomb, it was a lung, and it was breathing warm air. The despair vanished, burned away by a sudden, fierce surge of hope. It was a grim, ragged hope, but it was enough. She looked at the towering granite walls, no longer as the sides of a grave, but as a shield. The stone held the earth's warmth. It would hold her fire's warmth, too. She had a chance. It was a sliver of a chance, a knife's edge in the darkness, but it was there. She picked up Silas's axe, its weight familiar and reassuring in her hand. The work would be brutal, but now it would not be hopeless. The first task was to make the entrance defensible. The mouth of the fissure was a wide, vulnerable opening, a gaping invitation to the wind and to predators. Alara spent a week clearing the scree and fallen logs from the area just inside the entrance, her hands bleeding, her back a solid knot of fire. She used smaller logs as levers to move stones that seemed impossibly heavy, learning the simple physics of leverage and balance through painful trial and error. Every muscle screamed, but every stone moved was a victory. She began to build a wall, a thick, dry stone wall that would seal off the front of the fissure, leaving just enough space for a heavy door and a narrow opening near the top to let light in. The granite chunks were heavy and unforgiving. Lifting them was a torment. She would find a rock, study its angles, and then labor for an hour to wrestle it into place, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Boro would watch her, a silent sentinel, occasionally letting out a low bark when a stone would slip, as if in encouragement. She found a deposit of dense red clay near a creek at the bottom of the bluff. For days she did nothing but haul buckets of it up the treacherous slope. She mixed it with sand and water to create a thick, sticky mortar. Chinking the gaps in her wall was painstaking work. She pushed the cold, wet mortar into every crevice with her bare hands, the grit scraping her skin raw. But as the wall grew, so did her sense of security. It was a solid, tangible thing, a barrier she was building with her own pain and sweat against the world that had cast her out. Inside, the fissure was a long, deep cavern that narrowed as it went. The geothermal warmth was strongest at the very back. It was here she discovered the source of the fissure's other secret. A slow, methodical drip of water seeping through a crack in the ceiling and running down the rock face. It was pure and cold. She spent 4 days with a hammer and a sharpened piece of steel she'd salvaged from a broken wagon wheel, chipping away at the stone floor beneath the drip. It was agonizing work. The shock of each blow traveled up her arms, and the sound was deafening in the enclosed space. But slowly, a shallow basin took shape. She lined it with a thick layer of her red clay, smoothing it with wet hands until it was a perfect, waterproof bowl, her cistern. It filled slowly, drip by patient drip, a reservoir of life in the heart of the stone. She tackled the problem of heat and smoke next. A fire in the main cavern would fill it with smoke. But as she explored the walls, she found a smaller secondary fissure branching off near the entrance, rising straight up. It was a natural chimney. She built her hearth at its base, a deep pit surrounded by the largest, flattest stones she could find. These stones would absorb the heat from the fire, creating a thermal battery that would radiate warmth long after the flames died down. The day she finished the hearth was the day the first snows came. She lit the first fire, using dry tinder she had gathered, and a flint and steel from her pack. The kindling caught and the flames licked up the logs she had painstakingly dragged inside and stacked against a wall. The smoke, thick and white at first, was drawn perfectly up the natural chimney, disappearing into the rock. Warmth, real warmth, pushed back the cavern's chill. She sat before it, mesmerized by the dancing light, the heat soaking into her weary bones. Boro lay beside her, his head on her lap. For the first time in months she felt something akin to peace. She was not in a tomb, she was in a fortress. After a month of relentless labor, she knew she had to return to Promise Creek. She needed things her $20 couldn't buy on the first trip, things that now seemed not like luxuries, but essentials. She needed livestock. Her return to the town caused a stir. The woman who walked down the main street was not the same one who had left. She was gaunt, but her frame was corded with new muscle. Her face was weathered, and her eyes held a steady, unnerving calm. Her hands were a map of her labor, crisscrossed with scars and thick with calluses. She walked straight to Gable's Mercantile, Boro at her heels. Mr. Gable stopped sorting his inventory when she entered. He stared at her hands. "By God, girl," he whispered, "you're still alive." "I need 3 laying hens and a goat," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "And seeds, potato, carrot, turnip, whatever you have that will keep." He looked at her as if she were mad. Livestock? Seeds? Up there? Ilara, it's madness. Winter is here. They'll freeze before the week is out. I will pay you in the spring, she said, with firewood. I have an endless supply of deadfall. Gable hesitated, but something in her expression, not pleading but a statement of fact, made him relent. He sold them to her on credit, likely believing he would never see the money or the woman again. The townspeople gathered to watch the spectacle as Ilara tied a rope to the goat's collar and tucked the 3 protesting chickens into a burlap sack. They stared in silence as she began the long walk back up the mountain, a lone woman leading her tiny, pathetic flock into the frozen wilderness. The whispers that followed her were not of pity anymore, but of a morbid, certain curiosity. They were watching a ghost walk to her own grave. Back at the fissure, she introduced the animals to their new home. She had already walled off a small side cavern for them, deep enough inside to benefit from the geothermal warmth. The floor was covered with a thick bed of dry leaves and pine needles. The chickens, after a period of confused clucking, began to scratch and peck. The goat, surprisingly, seemed content, munching on dried grasses she had gathered. Their presence changed the feel of the place. The soft sounds of their life, a cluck, the soft stamp of a hoof, pushed back against the profound silence. Boro was her shadow, her guard, her only confidant. He seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. He never strayed far. At night he slept curled at the foot of her makeshift bed, a solid, warm weight in the darkness. When the loneliness threatened to overwhelm her, she would bury her face in his thick fur and talk to him, telling him about the progress of the wall, the level of the water in the cistern, the way the fire burned. He would listen, his tail thumping softly against the stone floor. He was the anchor that kept her from drifting away into the vast, silent emptiness of her isolation. The next phase of her plan was the most audacious. She would grow a garden, in the dead of winter, underground. She chose a section of the main cavern floor not too far from the entrance, where a sliver of daylight from the high window could reach. For 2 weeks, her only work was hauling soil. She found a small, sheltered meadow a quarter-mile down the bluff, where the soil was black and rich. Bucket by bucket, she carried it up the slope and into the cave. It was back-breaking, repetitive work that felt endless. She built low stone walls to contain the precious earth, creating 3 long raised beds. She planted the seeds with a reverence she hadn't known she possessed. The potatoes went in deep, followed by the carrots and turnips. She knew it was a gamble. But the cave had stable temperatures, no wind, and with the geothermal heat, the soil would never freeze. It was a desperate hope, a defiance of the natural order of things. As the first heavy snows of winter began to fall, sealing the high country off from the world, the mockery from the town found its way to her door one last time. It came in the form of Brant, the region's most successful trapper. He was a big man with a loud voice and an unshakable confidence in his own rugged competence. He'd ridden up on his horse, he said, to see the widow's folly for himself before it was buried in snow. He stood at the entrance, not daring to step inside, and surveyed her work with a smirk. He kicked at her stone wall. "This'll crack and fall in the first deep freeze," he declared. He pointed at the simple plank door she'd fashioned from fallen trees. "The wind'll take that for kindling." He laughed, a harsh, booming sound that echoed unnervingly in the quiet air. "Gable says you bought chickens. Chickens! You'd have been smarter to eat them on the way up." Ilara said nothing. She just stood there, her axe in her hand, watching him. Her silence seemed to unnerve him more than any argument would have. "Look," he said, his tone softening to one of feigned concern. "It's a shame what happened to you, but this is suicide. When you start to starve, don't eat the dog. He's a good-looking animal. I'll take him off your hands now. Save him the misery." Boro let out a growl that was low and serrated, a sound that promised violence. Alara put a hand on his head. "The dog stays," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of the stones she had lifted. "And you should go. The snow is getting heavy." Brant shrugged, the smirk returning. "Have it your way, Ice Widow." He swung himself up onto his horse. "I'll check for your bones in the spring thaw." He rode off, his laughter swallowed by the thickening snowfall. Ice Widow. The name stung, but she packed it away with the rest of the hurt. It was just another stone for the wall. Winter descended like a guillotine. The world outside the fissure disappeared behind a curtain of white. The wind became a constant, shrieking presence, a wild beast clawing at the face of the bluff. But inside Alara's fortress of stone, a quiet, orderly rhythm took hold. Her days were measured by small, essential tasks. She would wake in the deep, insulated dark, the only light the faint red glow of the fire's embers. Her first job was always the fire. She would add logs, coaxing it back to life, its warmth a daily resurrection. Then she would milk the goat, her hands working deftly in the dim light, the metallic tang of the milk a welcome scent. She'd collect the eggs, one sometimes two a day, each one a small, perfect miracle. She tended her impossible garden with fierce devotion. She watered the beds from the cistern, her fingers trailing through the cool, dark soil. When the first pale green shoots of the turnips pushed their way through the earth, she knelt and stared at them for a full hour, tears of relief freezing on her cheeks. Life. She was cultivating life in the heart of a dead winter. Her world shrank to the length of the cavern. It was a world of stone and firelight, of the smell of wood smoke and damp earth, of the soft sounds of her animals. The solitude was immense, a physical weight. There were days she thought the silence would break her. But the routine was her salvation. Tend the fire, milk the goat, collect the eggs, water the garden, check the snares she set for rabbits near the entrance, sharpen the axe, mend her clothes. The relentless cycle of these small acts of survival kept her sane. They were a testament to her existence. She was still here. The winter tested her systems. One night, a pack of wolves, gaunt and desperate with hunger, caught the scent of her livestock. They prowled outside her wall for hours, their howls a chilling chorus that seemed to seep through the stone. Boro stood before the door, every muscle tensed, his answering growls deep and ferocious. But the walls held. The heavy door did not splinter. The wolves, unable to find a way in, eventually moved on. Alara leaned against the cold stone, her heart pounding, and gave thanks for every rock she had lifted. A midwinter thaw was followed by a sudden, brutal freeze. The water on the rock faces outside turned to thick, glittering shields of ice. She heard the sharp crack of trees, their sap frozen and expanded, their trunks splitting open. But inside, the temperature remained constant. The geothermal warmth from the deep earth and the thermal mass of her hearth kept the cavern from dropping below freezing. Her water did not freeze. Her animals were safe. Her plants grew, slow and pale. But they grew. Her fortress was working. She was surviving not by fighting the winter, but by hiding from it within the earth itself. Then came the blizzard. It was not a storm. It was a war declared by the sky. It began not with snow, but with wind. A low moan from the north that grew over the course of a day into a physical screaming force that shook the very foundations of the mountains. It was a wind that carried death in its teeth, a wind that scoured and clawed and hammered. Then the snow came, not in flakes, but as a solid, blinding wall of white moving sideways. The world outside her door ceased to exist. There was only the white rage and the sound of the wind, a sound like a giant tearing the sky to pieces. In Promise Creek, the world broke. The town was built for normal winters, not for this Arctic monster. The first day, the roof of Gable's Mercantile, laden with a winter's worth of supplies, groaned under the impossible weight of the snow and then collapsed with a sound like thunder, burying the town's food supply. The great stained-glass window of the church, facing north, held for hours against the wind's assault before shattering inward, showering the pews with razor-sharp shards of colored glass and letting the blizzard into the house of God. By the second day, the town's confidence was gone, replaced by a primal freezing terror. The log cabins, chinked with mud and moss, proved porous as sieves. The wind found every crack, blasting fine, needle-like snow into homes, coating everything with a layer of frost. Fireplaces, consuming firewood at a frantic rate, couldn't fight back the killing cold. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air inside their own homes. Livestock, trapped in flimsy barns, began to freeze to death where they stood. Promise Creek, the proud self-sufficient settlement, was being dismantled, stick by stick, life by life. But inside the frost fissure, there was calm. The blizzard raged 100 feet above Alara's head. The wind shrieked over the top of the bluff, but down in her protected shelter, the air was still. She was buried in the mountain's lee, utterly shielded from the storm's fury. The fire in her stone hearth burned hot and steady, its smoke drawn cleanly up the natural chimney. The deep stone walls, warmed by the fire and the earth's own heat, radiated a gentle, constant warmth. Her animals were quiet in their pen, insulated from the terror outside. The water in her cistern was cool and clear. She moved through her routine, milking the goat, checking her garden, in a small, ordered bubble of warmth and life, an impossible island in an ocean of frozen chaos. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. On the third day of the blizzard, a sound broke through the monotony of the wind. It was a frantic, desperate pounding on her heavy plank door. It was a sound so unexpected, so alien in her solitary world, that for a moment she thought she had imagined it. But it came again, weaker this time, a frantic, exhausted drumming. Boro was already at the door, not with an aggressive growl, but with a low, confused whine. Alara unbarred the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it open against the stone wall. A figure, more a sculpture of snow and ice than a man, collapsed across her threshold. She dragged him inside, fighting the storm to force the door shut again, the roar of the blizzard momentarily filling her home before being cut off by the thick wood. She rolled the man over. Underneath the caked ice and snow was the face of Brant, the trapper. His skin was a waxy, bluish white. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were wide with a terror that went beyond the fear of death. He tried to speak, but his frozen jaw could only make a chattering sound. Alara acted quickly. She dragged him toward the fire, pulling off his frozen gloves and coat. His hands were stiff and white. She knew she couldn't warm him too quickly. She wrapped him in her wool blanket and gave him a cup of warm broth, holding it to his lips until he could manage to swallow. It was a long time before he could speak. When he finally did, his voice was a ragged croak. "My wife," he gasped. "My boy, Thomas." He pointed vaguely back in the direction he had come. "Cabin, roof collapsed. Fire's out. They're freezing." He looked at her, the man who had mocked her, who had called her a fool, and his face crumpled. "Please," he whispered, "help me." Alara looked at him, the memory of his sneering face, of his cruel words, Ice Widow, flashing in her mind. She thought of her own carefully rationed firewood, her precious stores of food. Helping him meant risking everything she had so painstakingly built. Saving his family would mean venturing out into the monster that he had just barely escaped. It was his pride, his certainty that had left his own family vulnerable. He deserved this. A cold, hard part of her wanted to say no. But then she saw the image of a child, a small boy named Thomas, freezing in the dark. She looked at her warm fire, her sheltered animals, her rows of growing food. She had built this place to survive. But what was survival if it meant becoming as hard and cold as the stone around her? She had not endured all this just to watch a child die. The choice was not a choice at all. "You will stay here and get warm," she said, her voice firm. "Tell me where your cabin is." She did not just give him supplies. She became the rescuer. While Brant thawed by the fire, she prepared. She loaded the small, sturdy sled she had built for hauling firewood with her thickest furs, 2 more blankets, and a large pot of hot stew, sealed with a lid. She filled a canteen with warm broth. She hitched Boro to the front of the sled. The dog seemed to understand, his body tense and ready. She wrapped herself in every layer she owned, pulling a hood tight around her face until only her eyes were exposed. When she opened the door, the blizzard met her like a solid wall. The wind stole her breath and tried to force her back. But she lowered her head and pushed into the storm, a small, determined figure against the vast, white fury of the world. Boro strained at the harness, his powerful body low to the ground, pulling the sled into the teeth of the gale. The journey to Brant's cabin was a nightmare, a blind fight for every single step against a wind that wanted to scour her from the face of the earth. She found them. Brant's wife, Mary, was huddled in a corner of the ruined cabin with their son, wrapped in a single thin blanket. The boy was pale and still, his breathing shallow. Mary looked up as Elara entered, her eyes vacant with despair, thinking her husband had perished. When she saw the supplies, the steam rising from the pot of stew, she simply began to weep, silent tears freezing on her face. Elara brought them back. The journey was a slow, brutal struggle, with the 3 of them huddled on the sled and Elara and Boro pulling them through the deepening drifts. When they finally stumbled through the door of the fissure, the shock on the faces of Mary and Brant was profound. It was the warmth that hit them first, a deep, penetrating heat that felt like life itself. Then their eyes adjusted to the firelight, and they saw the neat stack of firewood piled high against the wall, the chickens clucking softly in their pen, the goat watching them with curious yellow eyes. And then, the most impossible sight of all, the garden, 3 long beds of dark earth, from which the pale green tops of turnips and carrots were emerging. A garden, growing in a cave, in the middle of the worst blizzard in living memory. Brant, now warm and wrapped in a dry blanket, just stared, his mouth open. He looked from the garden to the cistern, from the animal pen to the smoke rising cleanly into the natural chimney. He looked at the solid stone walls that had mocked the storm, and finally he looked at Elara. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, gut-wrenching shame. Before he could speak, there was another, weaker, banging at the door. It was Mr. Gable and his wife, their faces masks of frozen desperation. Behind them were the Davies family, their neighbors. The mercantile was gone, their homes unlivable. They had come here as a last resort, following Brant's tracks, hoping for a miracle. They entered, and the same stunned silence fell over them as they took in the impossible sanctuary Elara had built. 11 people now stood in her home, refugees from the town that had pitied and scorned her. Mr. Gable, the man who had advised her to run, who had sold her the supplies for her folly, walked slowly toward the garden beds. He knelt and touched a green leaf with a trembling finger as if to confirm it was real. He stood up and turned to face her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "We called you the Ice Widow," he said, his voice thick and broken. He shook his head, a look of profound wonder and regret on his face. "My God, Elara, we were the fools." Elara felt the weight of their stares, their shame, their awe. This was her moment of triumph, the vindication she had earned with her own blood and sweat. A part of her wanted to unleash the bitterness she had stored for so long. But she looked at their frozen, weary faces, at the frightened eyes of the children, and the bitterness simply melted away. Vengeance was a cold and empty thing. Warmth was what mattered now. She simply nodded toward the pot of stew simmering by the fire. "There is food," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Eat. The children should be near the fire." Her grace was her victory. She offered no recriminations, no triumphant speeches. She simply provided. She moved among them, a queen in her stone hall, ladling out stew, handing out blankets, her actions speaking a language of forgiveness and strength far more powerful than words. The blizzard raged for another full day before it finally broke. When the survivors emerged from the frost fissure, they stepped into a world transformed, buried, and silent under a blanket of white. The journey back to Promise Creek was slow and somber. What they found was a town shattered, humbled, and frozen. The story of their survival spread faster than fire through a dry meadow. It was told in hushed, awe-struck tones, the tale of the Ice Widow and her impossible home carved from the rock. The derisive nickname was retired forever, replaced with something akin to reverence. People spoke of the Fisher house, of Ilara's wisdom, of the warmth she had shared when all the world was cold. Mayor Graves, who had lost nearly his entire herd and whose own grand house had suffered severe damage, was diminished, his authority cracked like frozen timber. In the weeks that followed, a slow pilgrimage began. People made the trek up to the frost fissure, not to mock, but to learn. They came with offerings, a bag of nails, a bolt of cloth, a young pig, and they came with questions. They studied her stonework, the genius of her natural chimney, the simple brilliance of her clay-lined cistern. They saw how she had used the very earth as a shield, not fighting nature, but working with it. When Promise Creek began to rebuild, it rebuilt differently. New homes were built with deep stone foundations and massive central hearths, designed to hold and radiate heat, modeled on Ilara's. The town learned her lesson of thermal mass. Her story became a local legend, a cautionary tale about pride, and a testament to resilience that travelers would carry to other towns and settlements. The frost fissure was no longer a symbol of worthlessness. It was a landmark, a monument to the woman who saw a home where others saw only a grave. Years passed. Ilara never left her home in the rock, but the world came to her. Her home expanded, not in size, but in life. She traded her surplus vegetables, eggs, and goat cheese for things she couldn't make. The path to her door became well worn. She was no longer an outcast, but the quiet, unshakable heart of the community. One cool autumn evening, years after the great blizzard, Ilara stood at the entrance of her home. She was older now, her face a testament to the sun and wind, her hands forever marked by her labor. At her side sat not Boro, but one of his descendants, a handsome gray dog with the same watchful eyes. She looked out at the valley below, where the lights of the rebuilt Promise Creek twinkled like fallen stars. She had been stripped of everything, cast out with nothing but a worthless deed and a refusal to be broken. From that nothing, she had built not just a shelter, but a life, a legacy. She had proven that the greatest strength is not found in what is owned or taken, but in what can be patiently, painstakingly, and gracefully built from the things that the world has thrown away.